So good morning, everyone. Welcome to this fifth in the series of webinars that we've been hosting. I'm just going to do a wee bit of an introduction. Some of you would have already heard that we were hoping Kevin was going to join us, but he's had some internet problems. So we'll carry on through, not to worry about that at all. But as I say, this is the fifth in the series of webinars that we've been hosting. And it's really for us to engage with our FAAM members and the wider community that are interested in the subjects that we've been discussing. And this is an extension of the asbestos limits discussion we've had. And some of you will know that the HSE had a research summit back at the beginning of March. They called on a lot of stakeholders within the industry. We're invited to a sort of interactive conference, really, to try and look at what research priorities could we come up with a list of priorities for research in our field. So we want to have a discussion with FAAM members about introducing those research priorities as we understand them right now. They may well change, we don't know, but have an early really discussion and engagement with members so that we can really think about how FAAM can feed into that debate, because obviously we want to be part of it. So as we talk about this, Gary was present, so was Kevin, and so was Jonathan. Unfortunately, Jonathan's busy and Kevin's got some IT problems. So Gary will introduce the summit, give an introduction. We've got some questions to ask you as members to feed back to us. But as Lee explained, please use the chat box, or if you want to raise your hand when we get to the appropriate point for Q&A with Gary, then we're happy to discuss this and take some of these things back, obviously, when the HSE are going to look in this in more detail. So I'm going to hand it over straight to Gary. And I don't think Gary needs any introduction, so I'm going to hand over to you, Gary, if that's okay. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, my computer's running a bit slow today, so am I. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see the screen. What we're talking about is this Research Priority Summit, and I guess the basic question is, how can FAAM contribute? We already have, and I'll just explain that a bit more. It was held at the beginning of March, and what we're trying to do is update and inform our FAAM membership with this particular webinar, but also hopefully to start a discussion on research. It's a bit like London buses. You wait 10 years for something to come along, then all of a sudden there's 8 or 14 research ideas that came out of this summit. So how do we tackle this as FAAM is really the question. We're struggling with that a little bit, so that's why we're having this webinar. So today we're going to hopefully get through 3 of the short list of research needs, just to start seeing, where we can go with this. And really, we're asking you, to help. So quick overview, it was a 1.5-day summit, started after lunch on the first day. There was a number of presentations at the beginning of each day by invited speakers. One of them was by John Cherry, who is going to be the main speaker at the conference in a month's time. And he was quite controversial, I would say. But anyway, that's enough. After these invited speakers, we had breakout sessions. There were 2 breakout sessions, so about an hour to an hour and a half, and they were broken up into 3 tables, which each discussed a different theme. There was a sort of HSE lead at each theme leader at each table that tried to write down what was discussed and try and get some sort of research idea together out of it. So the people around the table and at this meeting, there were stakeholders. They were particularly invited. They were campaigners, medics, learned societies, that's us, and academics from the UK and the EU. So it was a mixed bag of people, and some obviously had agendas to push as well. The three breakout groups were, well, you can see on the slide, ensuring prioritised safe removal, which Jonathan was at that table, understanding the contribution of past exposures via the built environment to disease risk, which was myself, and assuring the effectiveness of ongoing active management in situ was Kevin, who we hope will be able to join us. So what the idea was at the time was to ask each FAAM member at their table, because all the tables had different people and were discussing different things, you know, and there was quite large noise coming from one of them, not to say who that was. So it's to give you a little theme and then go on to the main research topic that they came up with, or idea. At the end of those of the meeting, we did have a voting session to prioritize all the different topics that came up. There were 8 in the final vote. So just to show you, just to go into what these were, what were the levels before, during and after removal, including non-licensed activities in a range of environments. So that was the one that Jonathan was at, who's not with us today, but we will try and record his 5-minute of impressions. So I've posted all this in the chat box if you want to look at it, but we'll come to this at the end. The second theme group, and this is the second highest priority. I'll explain briefly later why I chose this one, which is, can focus workplace sampling, for examples in schools and social housing, help define, guide and prioritise both current risk of asbestos related ill health and prioritise building replacement programme. So to me, can air sampling give us an idea of what the risk is in buildings? So I'll be addressing that. And you can see at the bottom, what I've done is put some suggestions as to, how we think we should try and answer these, what the FAAM members already have, and the quality and specificity of that data may have to the research question. But most importantly, can we even answer the research question, or is it well defined enough? And finally, which if Kevin joins us, we need to better understand the behaviours of actors in the system. Do people know or understand their legal roles and responsibilities under management of ACMs in situ and under the duty to manage? Now, I'm sure a lot of FAAM members bump up against this one time and time again. So what research we can do, I'm sure there's a lot of stories, but we've got to go to research. So that's the end of that one. So back over to Sarah. Do we know if Kevin's joined us, or?
I very much doubt he's going to make it, I'm afraid.
Okay. Well, let's, shall we go? I'll go on to my one and we'll give him a chance. And so I'll just share my slides. The one I was at was understanding the contribution of past exposures by the built environment to disease risk. Now, I had about 5 medics on my table, and I don't like to say bad words about medics, but it is a bit like herding cats. I found I've been to conferences pathologists and that, and it's unbelievable how things flow. So, but that's my opinion. But we did have good discussions, had a lot of trouble sticking to the past, and but some people were very rooted in the past as well, about things that happened 40 or 50 years ago. And I think that is the real best thing to bring back from this theme group, was that past exposures only produce disease that we can really identify 40 or 50 years later as mesothelioma. So that long lag time is always a difficult one. So what we came up, well, this was the second highest priority. I'll briefly cover the highest priority and tell you why I'm covering this one. So it can focus workplace sampling, help define and guide, prioritize current risks of asbestos related ill health, and prioritize building replacement programs. Now, there's two ways of looking at this, in my opinion. One is that we take some ambient samples during normal occupation, and there has been, work done on this in the past. Can you go in and take samples? And the problem is we do air sampling. Taking a long enough sample is quite difficult. You can take a sample for a day. Taking a sample for a week is just possible, but after that, either you keep coming back and coming back, so you're always taking a snapshot, in my view. So let's go through what I think about this. My answer to this one was no, don't even ask this one, partly because it was tried in the States in the 90s, and there's a paper, this is their sort of summary paper by Leon Van Orden, who are a NEVLab accredited lab, but they did work mainly for lawyers, litigation lawyers, who were the defense. So, you can say, well, they must have been biased a bit, but I have looked and compared their data in the past, and although there's a bit of bias, maybe if you look at other measurements, it's not far off. So, and they would just go in there as a lab and take in samples. So I've probably said enough to get a couple of lawyers, American lawyers, after me already. But it's that's the situation. So they did a massive sampling program over a number of years, mainly in buildings with sprayed asbestos, friable sprayed asbestos, which you don't really see in this country in the way you have it in the States. It's called cotton candy. So they took nearly 4,000 indoor samples in 752 buildings, and that's 32 man years of sampling, they reckoned, just sampling, let alone analysis. And of these samples, 317 schools, 196 universities, 234 public and commercial buildings, and some residences. So there's all the figures. I'm not going to read them all out. So it was a massive effort, and we'd be hard matched to do anything like that in the UK. And what they found was 99.9% of the samples were less than 0.01. And that's for TEM fibers longer than 5 microns. So that's any thinness of fiber. No building averaged above 0.004. And 90% of the buildings, there was no detected asbestos fibers that would have been visible optically using their definition of greater than 0.25, which is we'll come back to that in another in the next seminar, webinar perhaps. but no asbestos was detected of any size, and this is greater than half a micron long, short asbestos fibres in a quarter of these buildings, occupied. So the average concentration was 3012, which isn't far off the 305 that we found in the UK in the 1980s, and the background outdoor concentrations, lo and behold, in some situations were higher. Not every. So that's why I said, no, I don't think, it's been done already. I don't think that's a great idea. So I'm very happy to turn that over to discussion, but I'll just very quickly say what the top priority one was, which I did explain. We had at least 6 medics in our group. And what they came up with is what are the environments and populations most at risk of asbestos exposure and associated risk of mesothelioma by linking data from the ONS, DWP and THOR networks and other sources. Now, I can explain that, but it will take a long time, okay? But the THOR network is about 300 respiratory consultants who get funded by HSE to report to Manchester University some of their findings. So, and ONS is the Office of National Statistics, and DWP is obviously the Department of Work and Pensions. Now, I think it's outside FAAM scope to try and work out how linking databases and what medics think, can be made sense of. But they did have this final idea. Maybe they should include a longer term follow-up of asbestos removal workers. So, that maybe, again, that's a medical follow-up. And what they got exposed to in the past would be very interesting to know. And my idea, that's all the definitions, was, again, there's this massive lag time of 30, 40 years. But thinking about it, at the present time, we're 40 years on from the asbestos licensing, act, where we had licensed asbestos removers and they had to have medicals every 2 years and start keeping records. So these are only supposed to be held for 40 years. So we should have this vast data source of what licensed asbestos removers were exposed to. So maybe there is something we can do for that. But how we get that data is another matter. So I'm going to stop sharing now. So I've sort of covered 2 topics because of the no show of other people, but it'd be good to have a discussion now and some feedback.
Thank you, Gary. I apologise again for Kevin not being able to join us, but we will try and get his thoughts down so that when we put the webinar together, we'll have Jonathan and Kevin's thoughts. But going back, Gary, John Richards asked a question about monitoring on site. When we're talking about the reduction of the OEL in the EU and how they're going to approach that in terms of monitoring, and not forgetting that the OEL only applies to the worker rather than environmental monitoring or even post clearance. That's for each member state to work out. But certainly the monitoring side of things and the analysis, they're going to move to more electron microscopy, possibly TEM rather than SEM. What do you think the UK should be thinking about in terms of, if we're going to be looking at low levels of potential exposure, do we have the capability to do that in the UK at the moment?
Well, I think that should be answered by FAAM members, but I mean, I'm very clear that even SEM, let alone TEM, adds greatly to the expense, and there'd be far fewer samples being taken. So why do you need SEM and TEM? You don't really need it for OELs. You know, it's not necessary in my view, because what we want to do is control worker exposure. And if you control worker exposure, you usually control a lot of the passerby exposure, or what they leave. So my own view is that you want something that realistically works for, asbestos removal and maintenance. The longer term thing is SEM and TEM will be needed if you want to do ambient air sampling for normal occupants. But as I just shown, it doesn't, if you try and work out the percentage chance of picking up an incident or an exposure, say you sample for 1 day and people are in a building 200 days a year, that's a 0.5% chance. And then if you've got 100 rooms in that building, you've got a 0.005% chance of picking up an incident. And whenever I went sampling, I always looked for the worst case situation, or the most occupied situation. But it's really, it's almost happenstance. So let's focus on controlling workers, and SEM and TEM won't really help do that.
So is it more to do, and I'll throw this open to everyone, but is it more to do with how we're capturing the sample, not necessarily the analysis? Because if the worker, we know how to manage that, but when we're talking about ambient, we haven't really got a methodology that would enable us to capture long term, have we? At the moment, that's standard.
No, I mean, what, in a building? Yeah. Well,
or even outdoors.
As I said, the doing it for a whole working week, ambient, is just about possible because I've done it. Yeah. And but after that, it gets that's about it really. There are other ways of doing it, which I won't go into, but at the moment, using conventional membrane filter sampling, for ambient sampling, and it's a bit of luck as well whether you don't oversample. It's just possible. Does that answer the question?
I think so. I think there's a lot more to unpack.
Yeah.
But is anyone
can we
the
bring
webinar?
in Nick? Because the third Nick's problem about sampling was a whole webinar. So I think the other part of the question really is Nick Garland to answer. How long should we sample for? For OELs or workplace.
Nick, do you want to come in?
Yeah. Okay.
On the spot.
I mean, it's very difficult, really. I mean, we've got an awful lot of data, but it's all following the normal rules of what you need for occupational exposure limits. So they're all 2 to 4 hours at the absolute most. Their snapshot, their testing of people behaving as well as they can possibly behave. So as ways of prioritizing where we're going to be doing removal, I'm struggling to see how it could actually how it could actually contribute. And the other thing as well with the asbestos network, that's about to be releasing guidance on leak monitoring, where that's going to become the focus is going to be back on that, and therefore we should be doing an awful lot more of it, because it's actually always been mandatory to do that on every job. Even then, that's only ever going to give us results of 0.01. It will be all less than 0.01. So unless we can actually persuade people to do 400 graticules or 800 graticules, then we're actually not going to get anywhere near background on those, and we're not going to halve the filters. So it's difficult to know how we're going to get the data that is going to support this. at all.
Can I just add something to that, Nick? The actual presentations at this summit, there was one from Denmark about SEM, using a FAAM SEM, which I said would always be necessary. And they had real problems with the sampling, and even with a maximum of 2-hour samples at, to measure the OEL at the work face, they were oversampling. And if you read the French papers, the TEM, they never sampled for more than 2 hours, to get their OELs. So what we find in the UK has been replicated across Europe when they've actually tried to actually sample and measure the OEL, which many countries don't even bother.
Shall we, well, John's put his hand up. John, would you like to come in and unmute yourself, please?
Sorry, Sarah. But there's a European working group of labs that use SEM, TEM, that are doing quite a lot of research on this at the moment, and they're making quite a lot of inroads in terms of improving the analytical sensitivity. So it is possible. It's just it all comes at a cost, and that's probably the biggest stumbling block is nobody's prepared to put their money in their pocket to fund any of this work, and that's consecutive governments, and sort of we end up in the position where we are sort of 40 years after licensing, still not being able to determine what the risk is.
Okay, good point. Good point. Do you have a link to any of that research that might be carried out?
I'm not sure I can share it, Sarah, to be perfectly honest with you. But if there's a point in time when I can do, I will. Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be useful.
Yeah.
Because obviously Europe is speeding ahead with this because they have to, and we're just talking about it now as to what the impact could be. But most of us, I think, we know where we want to be, a better working environment for all workers and no asbestos in buildings, which would be good. Kerry, thank you, John. Kerry, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I think everyone's struggle is probably with the guidance that says about obviously less than 0.01 is that clearance indicator, and there's meant to be a transient level.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've got nothing below that to where you met the transient level 2. I mean, we've started doing some of these long running air tests, trying to get down to 305 using vario flow XL pumps.
Yeah. And what have you found? Have you got some good data from that?
Been quite successful, but we're looking at combining that with good management and having monitoring to that level to show that the asbestos in the buildings is in a good condition and being well managed. Just to provide additional reassurance to people in the buildings that we own or occupy.
And are you using PCM only rather than EM, or?
We've sent a few off for SEM where there's been higher results detected.
Okay, of thinner fibres, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that would be useful. Maybe we need to tap you for some data then. Gary will be after you.
I think he's already talking to one of my colleagues about better fuels.
Yeah. Well, Gary and FAAM, obviously, the FAAM community would be very interested in that, because the more data we have of good quality data, then it is going to feed into the debate and will help us feed back into HSE from the FAAM side of things. So we'll certainly be in touch. And Thank you. David Birkin. Hello, David.
Hello. Yeah, I think I raised this in one of the previous calls that we had. That we often do high volume monitoring, taking it down to 0.0002 outside, 0.0005 inside. Been doing it for about the last 4 years, so we've got quite a lot of data on this. So happy to discuss that with Gary if it's of any use. But it's something that we're pushing quite a lot with our clients, because clearly the 0.01 480 litre monitoring isn't really very useful.
And are you finding any challenges with the sampling process?
After about 9 months, the motors on the pumps burn out and we have to replace them. But then that's, they've been running for a long time. Occasionally they get clogged. If you put it vaguely near to an engine that's running, it'll just get clogged with diesel very fast. But inside buildings, Generally, people don't like noisy pumps running, so we'll opt for, say, the Casella ones that you can mains power at 12 litres a minute or less and just run them for longer. And 3A have just brought out a new pump. I've asked them to develop on it, and they do about 25 hours at 16 litres on one battery charge.
Oh, on 16 litres. Oh, that's pretty
Yeah.
good. And what about, again, same as I asked Kerry, that in terms of analysis, are you sending them off for electron microscopy as well?
Yeah, we'll run on some of them. We'll run polycarbonate filters in parallel to the regular cellulose ones. So rather than cut them in half, we'll do a polycarbonate because they're a bit easier to analyse.
Yeah.
And yeah, we're having some positives.
Okay, and are you finding a difference between obviously the PCM count and the SEM in terms of picking up thinner fibres?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So it sounds as though organisations, and I guess duty holders, are they warm to the fact that the sampling takes a long time, but also the analysis and the cost? Are you able to, duty holders are on board with that?
Yes. Okay. So first of all, once you hit them with the fact that the 480 litre sample volume isn't particularly useful, other than for something like a leak test or clearance, then they're receptive to that. But obviously you bundle it with a whole package. So you go into a building where the asbestos cement roof's falling to bits, and it's part of your overall management. It's not on its own. Also, we've been doing road sweeping with an adapted road sweeper with a HEPA filter on top, and you analyse the level of asbestos in the waste and compare that to the IOM research paper from '88, where it gives you the likely fibre concentrations. And then, the whole thing's all wrapped up in one job as opposed to being on its own. I wouldn't go to site and simply run an 8,000 litre sample and come up with an answer.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you've been doing some very interesting work.
Is it worth saying that is this a specific environment though? These are hangars, isn't it? That you're sampling large sheds.
Yeah, well, partly, yeah. I mean, most of the site is hangars, but there are other occupied buildings that aren't.
Yeah.
But that one particular site, I suppose, where we learned how to do it 5 years ago, and we're rolling it out across a number of sites now, a number of clients.
Yeah. No, certainly. As I said, you can sample for a week at certain rates, but that's about it. But depends what rate you go at.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's opening up a lot of questions about sampling, but also, about controlling the risk. And Nick's asked a pertinent question here about shouldn't we just prioritise where we know the risk is greater, schools, hospitals, because sick people don't want to get sicker and children don't want to be exposed, and so there's a potential to miss the debate really. But that's opening up a whole can of worms. So thanks Nick. We've got another webinar coming out on that, I think. Alan, do you want to come in?
Yeah, it's just furthering on what from Kerry said. We've developed a strategy for doing the ambient background air monitoring, and we're kind of writing a paper which will then give to our analytical consultancies who can follow the guidance as to how to complete that, because currently there's no guidance in 248 as to how to do that. So we've kind of done some testing and developed the best way to do that. So we'll issue that. And also what we're looking to encompass is that after any asbestos remediation work, that 2 days after, we'll then go back and do an ambient air test to ensure the air levels are back to normal conditions, kind of thing. Because obviously, as was mentioned previously, 0.01 isn't considered a safe level. It's passes an enclosure, but we want to make sure that after enclosure gets passed and everyone's away, that the levels are back to background levels. If not, we can look to take whatever action we need to take.
Can I just ask, Alan, have you found any results that would concern you post removal?
We've not got it in place as of yet. We've done
okay.
quite a few backgrounds just as part of routine air testing, and we generally do routine air testing to 0.01 anyway, but we're trying to encompass this doing ambient background levels during that, and do a bit more and more as we go. Say we're still kind of getting our feet on the tail as it is, but the plan is to have it after any remediation work, and also as part of our kind of routine air testing we do across our sites.
Which Nick explained earlier, that the technical working group is producing some guidance, and I guess it will encompass that kind of post removal as well. Nick, have you got anything to add to that?
Yes, well, that is the idea. The existing ACOP, it already does clearly say, it's testing before, during, and after. But it's quite immediately after, as in, the enclosure has come down now, and now it is a time for reassurances, either whilst the enclosure is coming down or very shortly after. So this follow up in a week, 2 weeks, Alan, I don't know how soon were you doing these testings or planning on doing these testings?
Well, we're doing ambience as routines at the moment, but we're developing an air monitoring system with one of our suppliers, which we'll be able to do easier to do backgrounds in, and actually automatically prompt after a clearance to do a background test. So that's probably after summer that will be ready, kind of thing. But we'll still be doing the routines in the meantime.
Okay, thank you for that, Alan. And
okay,
thank you.
shall we move on maybe to Kevin's question, assuming he's not here? Have you got it on the back of your slides to save me trying to?
I've got Jonathan's question.
Okay, let's do Jonathan's then, because that might be
do that.
It's in the beginning of the chat box, if anybody wants to see it. Right. Okay.
Yeah, so if you go scroll further up the chat box, you'll see the 3 questions.
Yeah.
But, okay.
So what are the levels before, during, and after removal, which is sort of what we've just been discussing, including non-licensed activities in a range of environments, including skips, ground, and cleared land. I think the last bit comes from the latest, research report from HSE on asbestos. I forget the number now, 1146 maybe, where they did some more measurements, outside the enclosure, and because of the lower level of respiratory protection, they were saying, well, there was, even though the levels were low, there was potentially more risk than the removers inside the enclosure. So I think that's where the extra bit came from at the end. But what are the levels before, during, and after removal? That's essentially what we've been talking about. So there does seem to be quite a lot of data that maybe we could try and work with that, as FAAM, to try and collect and again, what I'm trying to say is that these research questions are in their infancy. They haven't grown up yet. They haven't been tested. How can we best do this? What data do we have already? So this is a very, if we move on to that then now, Sarah, I won't try and explain what happened at the table because I wasn't there.
So yeah, as we said earlier, hopefully we'll get an update from Jonathan that we can splice into the webinar when we put it on the YouTube channel. But I see David's got his hand up. David, do you want to come in? Is there something you want to?
Yeah, I just want to clarify a bit about the ground and cleared land. I was lucky enough to be on one of the tables when we were discussing this, and the bit I raised was specifically if you've got something like a building that's full of flock, dial back to the 1960s when it was sprayed, the area immediately around the building will be pretty contaminated. And then in the 80s, when they washed it down the drains, that'll be contaminated. So it was greater awareness and how do we actually monitor investigate that, because when you're doing an asbestos survey, you'll say the condition of the building, and generally the ground around the building won't really be considered. And then when somebody comes and knocks the building down, all due respect to their SI work, it might not have been done very well. So when they build a new building, you end up with contaminated land remaining, even though there's a new building there.
Okay, so it's going to touch on the brownfield development side of things, not just the built environment. Yeah,
but you do have a specific hotspot around buildings that have got a lot of ASI in them.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for contributing. I haven't seen if anyone else wants to pitch in, but we've got sort of three sort of focused discussions here to look at data, and we've already. Sorry,
Sarah, can I just ask a question for? I mean, it'll be from for Jonathan when he actually does his recording. But what was the goal of this research? As in, what were they hoping that the data would help them decide or do, or
Yeah, if I may, I think the goal is, well, if we're going to remove asbestos from buildings, do you do it prior to demolition, or do you do it, just because you think it's a desirable thing to do, and then put people back in the building and potentially expose them? So say after a major refurbishment, have they, I mean, we all know the stories where it's been removed and you go back in and you see a bit of a horror show. So, is it worthwhile to do anything other than pre-demolition removal? I think is the question behind this. What's the data? If we're going to spend a lot of money on doing early removal and leave the building and then refurbish it, are we actually reducing the risk, given that you've given a load of removers a much bigger risk at the beginning and much earlier, when the technology could be much better in 20 years' time? So it's almost, when do you remove the asbestos is the question, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, as my comeback would be that it feels as though the manage in situ argument is on the losing track at the moment, and things like hospitals, schools, it's the accidental exposure that is happening because they don't manage. It's not managed effectively in situ. So that was my concern, that the HSE were effectively angling for this as justifying, let's carry on with managing in situ for the next 30 or 40 years and wait for the buildings to just go out of use. And I suppose that was my concern, that's what it would be useful.
Yeah, I think they have changed their view from what they put out before this summit, was that we're going to have to remove the asbestos. How can we best do it? I have written an article, maybe, for the newsletter where that's made a bit plainer, so.
Thank you. Yeah, and the newsletter is due out for the FAAM members this week. So watch, I think probably before the weekend. So watch out for that and Gary's article. So as Gary explained, these priorities for research are still in their infancy, and still we need to feed into that. So looking at any data that FAAM members might have, and we know we've got, because John Richards and the team behind the AIIC, have already got hold of a lot of data in terms of the surveying side, but not so much maybe on the air testing. Is that right, John?
That's a fair assumption, Sarah.
Yeah. I mean, I know NORAC has asked Start Software and teams if we can have a clearance data research report, which sort of helps us to understand where the priorities are in terms of the risk for analysts on site in the clearance process, and that's been really useful. So we know we can do it, but how can we do it? And obviously it's going to take a long time to sift through those data sets, because there's going to be slightly nuances between them, a bit like we found, or John found, with looking at the different types of floor tiles that are out there, or naming. So it might not be so bad with the air testing data, but there's going to be a lot of data, and how do we design research which we could feed into this model that could answer that question. So has anyone else got anything they want to add to this point that Jonathan sort of sat in with, and obviously David did as well?
Could I raise a question, Sarah?
Yeah, please.
Is this all a fudge to actually stop things progressing? Because at the end of this, we're 40 years into this now. If we apply some common sense rather than looking at the data, we shouldn't be seeing some of the things in schools that we still see in schools. Flock, for instance, which I've seen in a number of schools in recent times. Surely we should be looking at what makes sense logically and progressing with that, rather than putting it off for years at best, for decades at worst, waiting to come up with a strategy for dealing with our asbestos legacy. And for me, probably the most important question that we need to ask at the moment is why the number of licence notifications dropped from 30,000 a year to 20,000 a year since COVID, because that suggests we're not doing as much as we were. And is this all being picked up by the non-licensed sector, which nobody's got any handle or any eye on what they're doing, and are they causing more exposure than's going to happen as far as controlled removal is concerned?
Wow, John, that's a wide scope to
discuss. It is, Sarah.
You're absolutely right.
Are we being led down the garden path?
Well, I think, as Gary said, and I'm sure Gary will come in, I think the HSE are listening, and that certainly Sir Stephen Timms is listening, and he's the one that's sort of pushing this at the moment. And there are lots and lots of discussion going on, and I think as professionals, we need to put the pressure on. And I know you're doing that, John, the work you do, and many others on this call are as well. We've got to keep raising those difficult questions, and I think FAAM will do that, and we are doing that, but we've got to do it in a way that has got some teeth. So collecting data, looking at what we have already and what we don't have, which is where we want to feed into the research. But we don't want this research to take 10 years and then we find out that it's just got a lag time, because obviously we know the HSE take a long time to go through policy and checking. I mean, look at the report that came out recently. I mean, it was out of date. We've had 248 since then. So we want to make it accessible so that we can move forward. I think we all know what the answer is, but we've got to actually put it into science, really, to ask those questions and answer them. Sorry, Gary.
It was a research summit, so don't read policy into it.
No, not at all.
Shall we move on to the final question? And I'll try and find it in my presentation. I'll just have to read it. It's in the box at the top. Need to better understand behaviours of actors in the system. Do people understand their legal roles and responsibilities under management of ACMs in situ and under the duty to manage? So this is really hitting the point that I think John was saying. I'm desperately, it's weird. Okay, so can we better understand the behaviours of actors, their legal roles, responsibilities under the management of ACMs in situ and under the duty to manage? So I guess this is the status quo example. I don't know what's happened to my screen, but I'll stop sharing. So that's the question. So what John was just saying, you can say HSE are just delaying doing anything or everything or nothing. You can all have an opinion, but the issue is it takes a vast amount of money. So how do we get to zero asbestos is, I think, what the argument is now. And obviously to keep managing is important. So really, what do we think? Do all the actors know what their roles are? you know, the big problem, the duty to manage, has to, you know, it relies on hundreds and thousands, if not tens of thousands of people understanding what they're doing. Any response to that?
No, I think you got away with that, Gary. Oh
No,
no, John's
JR.
come back. John's come back.
He hasn't, Sarah. So yeah, it does require a lot of thought in terms of how this is handled, but we have no strategy for this at the moment, and we can't look in the asbestos isolation any longer. You know, there's 50 billion pounds worth of backlog maintenance in the public building sector, and what we've got to be careful of is that we don't end up dealing with other things and not taking into consideration the asbestos at the same time. So, you know, recent things that I've seen, for example, is a school doing energy lighting upgrades and then fixing new light fittings to AIB ceiling tiles when there should have been a more integrated approach in terms of, you know, removing the asbestos issue at the same time as dealing with the lighting issue. But it's not happening. You know, it's the constant leave and manage, which has been sort of ingrained into everybody at the moment, and we need to move away from that somehow.
Sorry, are you really talking about austerity here?
I'm talking about an approach, Gary, which we just seem to lack at the moment. You know, there is no incentive to deal with the asbestos at the moment, you know, because people are still believing that we should be leaving and managing. And going back on what HSE have said, I've been shared with some correspondence by one of the unions, which would suggest that sort of, you know, we may not see what has been said at meetings from sort of senior management within HSE.
Yeah, I mean, leaving and managing was, you know, I mean, you know, my understanding of the duty to manage was that you prioritized, and I know we can have a long conversation on that, the most likely to be disturbed and friable materials for removal or you know, remediation, you know, putting a board in front of them, until you reached the end of building life or the natural refurbishment, when you would carry out a removal survey and then remove all the asbestos. I mean, that's my understanding of what the current policy is. But that's politics, so you know, I'm not going there, but that's my understanding. Nick is
I think Philip was before Nick. So
yeah,
Philip,
yeah.
would you like to come in?
Yeah, just call me Phil, please, Sarah.
No, I wasn't. I was going to do that, but then I thought I'd be polite and say Philip. So
No,
hello,
that's
Phil.
all right. So a lot of people say me, oh God, not him again. But it, to me, it, you know, I agree with what John said entirely. But by the same token, the main driver in the circumstance I find myself in is predominantly cost. I know that's an obvious thing to say, but I'll say it anyway, simply because of the fact that as it stands at the moment, it's also what the regulations say, and until I feel that the HSE can look at it, you know, okay, bringing the data in to support what we're trying to say to them makes perfect sense. That's great, but I think by the same token, also it's got to the point where even with the data, even with all of that, the government and the HSE can still take a view of saying, well, we can still leave and manage, where certainly in the sector that I work in, the buildings, without going into too much details, we're talking about buildings from, you know, the 70s, the 60s, straight through to Victorian era, even. Trying to maintain them is, as I'm sure everybody can appreciate, a very difficult task at the best of times. The money that we get from our client is, well, that's another story entirely. I won't comment on that. But the point I'm trying to make is ultimately is that at the moment, the only option we have is to leave and manage, because as soon as we approach our client and say, you need to spend out on A, B, C, D, etc., they'll say, what is the cheapest option? Do we need to remove it? Can we keep it in situ? Can we just manage it? And a lot of the time, unfortunately, at the moment, it's just literally the case that we'll keep it in situ. And then unfortunately, where we get circumstances further on, maybe like 6 months down the line, where I've got to go back to the said client and say to them, well, actually, it now needs to be removed because even though you've made safe for now, it's gone back exactly the same way that it did previously.
So it's multi-factor, isn't it? You know, there's lots of pressure. But again, if we don't keep having the conversations and pushing ahead with data, with science behind it, which is what FAAM is all about, then we possibly could change the direction, which I think there's a window of opportunity right now for us to put that pressure on. So thank you for sharing that, Phil, because I can feel your frustration as well, which many of us feel as well, I'm sure, as consultants. So thank you for that. Nick, would you like to come in with your question?
Just briefly then. I mean, I don't know whether it is brief, but going back to the question, which is what research, how can we help with the research on this? I think duty to manage, the failure in duty to manage is the failure in our ability to communicate successfully with the duty holders and actually get them encouraged to move in the right direction. Yeah, the rules, you know, have been very clear, like Gary has just said, for forever now. But as we can see from the latest CIC data, you know, things are pretty static. They just stay as they have been. So I think the CIC data is likely to potentially give us some data to actually see how people are doing. And with the actual certificate, that's the first time we've tried something different to actually encourage clients and duty holders to actually move in the right direction. So I think getting that right, and I think there might be mistakes with the all red colouring. I think we should try and use things that have worked in the past to actually encourage people to actually move in the right direction, like the different colours. But I think that's where the nearest we've got to research that could actually give us something on this.
I'm aware of the time, Sarah, if you want to wash up, but herding cats comes back to my mind from what Nick's just said. It's the sort of game we're in.
Right, just as a very last, I think I've shared Gary's, sorry. Just before we go, just a plug for really, because our hour is just gone. So thank you very much for attending today and all the contributions. There's going to be more on this, obviously, as it becomes clearer what the HSE want to look at as their priorities. But if you can spare a bit of time for the FAAM conference, then please do come along. We're going to be obviously discussing this and more, so please do, if you've got time. Tickets aren't that expensive. I know it's money and I know it's time, but please come and join us in Birmingham. It's in May, so it's coming up in 5 weeks' time, if you can. And we're looking to another webinar before the summer break, really, towards the end of June. So look out for that. We'll advertise that. And if you want to catch up on these webinars, we'll send a link after the webinar today, but you can follow us on YouTube. And also we will be sending out a Survey Monkey after the webinar in the next couple of days, so that we can sort of gauge some feedback so that we can feed into the next webinar, and also, you know, sort of putting something together for the HSE. So thank you very much for your time today. Thank you, Gary. I'm sorry about Jonathan and Kevin not joining us, but we're as we say, we'll put a webinar together with their contributions as well. So thank you for today, and enjoy the rest of the day, hopefully in the sunshine, and a good Easter. Thank you very much. Take care for now. Bye. Thank you.
See ya.